The Michael Jackson DNA mystery most people never notice for decades. Millions of people believe they were looking at one of the biggest mysteries in entertainment history, a mystery involving appearance, identity, transformation, and perhaps even genetics. His name was Michael Jackson, and despite becoming one of the most photographed people on Earth, the public never stopped asking the same question: who was the real Michael Jackson? At first glance, that question sounds simple, but the deeper you look, the more complicated it becomes. Because people weren't only curious about his music, they weren't only curious about his fame. They became fascinated by something far more personal: his appearance. Year after year, newspapers discussed it. Television shows debated it, fans argued about it, critics analyzed it. Eventually, an unusual pattern emerged. The conversation slowly shifted away from Michael Jackson, the artist, and toward Michael Jackson, the mystery. Many people believed the answers could be found by studying his face, his family, his genetics, his DNA. But what if that entire approach was wrong? What if people spent decades looking in the wrong direction? Because when most people hear the word DNA, they think about biology. They think about inherited traits, eye color, hair color, family resemblance, the physical blueprint that helps shape who we become. But there is a problem. DNA can explain many things. It cannot explain greatness. It cannot explain imagination. It cannot explain creativity. And it certainly cannot explain why one human being becomes a global phenomenon while millions of others do not. Yet somehow, discussions about Michael Jackson repeatedly return to genetics. The question is, why? Why did people become so obsessed with Michael Jackson's DNA? Because if we're being honest, very few people were actually interested in science. What they really wanted was certainty. They wanted an explanation, something simple, something concrete, something they could understand. But Michael Jackson was never simple, and that may be why the fascination never disappeared. You see, human beings dislike mysteries. We naturally search for answers, patterns, explanations. And when we encounter someone who seems impossible to fully understand, curiosity becomes obsession. Michael Jackson may be one of the greatest examples of that phenomenon in modern history. The more famous he became, the more people tried to solve him. Some searched through interviews, others searched through headlines. Some searched through rumors, and eventually many began searching through the idea of DNA itself, as though genetics might reveal a hidden truth nobody else could see. But perhaps the biggest mystery was never inside his DNA. Perhaps it was inside something much harder to measure: identity. Because throughout his life, Michael Jackson existed between two worlds: the world people saw and the world people imagined. The real Michael and the version millions created in their minds. The problem is that those two versions were rarely the same. And that difference changed everything. Think about it. Most people spend their lives being known by a relatively small number of people: friends, family, co-workers, neighbors. Michael Jackson was known by the entire world, or at least, people believed they knew him. But knowing about someone and understanding them are very different things. The public knew the headlines. The public knew the image. But did they know the person? That question may be the true DNA mystery. Not biological DNA, personal DNA, the emotional DNA that makes someone who they are. Because when you strip away the fame, the records, and the headlines, a much deeper question appears. What actually made Michael Jackson different? Was it genetics? Was it talent? Was it childhood experience? Was it imagination? Or was it something nobody has fully understood yet? The deeper researchers, biographers, and fans look into his story, the more difficult that question becomes, because every answer seems to create another mystery. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we examine Michael Jackson's childhood. Because long before the world became obsessed with his appearance, long before people debated his identity, long before anyone mentioned DNA, something happened that may have shaped the rest of his life. something that cannot be found in a laboratory, something that cannot be explained by genetics alone. And if that hidden piece of the puzzle is as important as some people believe, then the real Michael Jackson DNA mystery may have nothing to do with biology at all. Instead, it may be connected to a question most people never think to ask. What experiences helped create the person behind the legend? Because in the next chapter, we're going back to the beginning. Back to the years before global fame. Back to the years before the world knew his name. Back to a hidden pattern that may completely change the way we think about Michael Jackson's story. And once you see that pattern, you may never look at the DNA mystery the same way again. If the real Michael Jackson DNA mystery isn't hidden inside genetics, then where is it hidden? To answer that question, we need to travel back in time, back before the stadiums, back before the headlines, back before the world began analyzing every detail of his appearance, back to a small house in Gary, Indiana, because this is where the mystery truly begins. Most people assume greatness starts with talent, but talent alone rarely explains a life story as unusual as Michael Jackson's. Thousands of children are talented. Very few become cultural icons. So what made Michael different? Many people point toward genetics. After all, music ran through the Jackson family, performance ran through the Jackson family, entertainment seemed almost woven into their history. But here's where things become interesting. Genetics may explain potential. They don't explain destiny. DNA can provide ability. It cannot explain how a child responds to pressure. It cannot explain imagination. And it certainly cannot explain what happens when childhood disappears earlier than expected. That is why some researchers believe the most important clues in Michael Jackson's story are not biological at all. They're emotional. Think about it. Most children experience life in stages. They gradually discover the world. They slowly develop confidence. They make mistakes. They learn from them. But Michael Jackson's childhood moved at a completely different speed. Before most children have figured out who they are, Michael was already performing. Before most children worried about high school, Michael was becoming internationally known. His life accelerated before his identity had time to catch up, and that may be one of the most important clues in this entire mystery. Because what happens when a child becomes famous before becoming fully formed? What happens when public expectations arrive before personal identity? The answer isn't always obvious, but psychologists have observed something fascinating. When people lose important experiences during childhood, they often spend years trying to reconnect with those experiences later in life. Not consciously, not deliberately. Emotionally, the mind has a remarkable tendency to revisit unfinished chapters, and suddenly many aspects of Michael Jackson's life begin looking different. The themes of wonder, the themes of imagination, the fascination with fantasy, the desire to create magical worlds. What if those weren't random interests? What if they were clues? Because throughout his life, Michael repeatedly returned to the same emotional ideas: childhood, wonder, dreams, possibility, innocence. Most adults gradually move away from those themes. Michael seemed drawn back toward them again and again. The question is why? Because if DNA was truly the answer, these patterns wouldn't matter. Yet they do. They matter a lot. In fact, they may tell us more about Michael Jackson than any laboratory test ever could. Because DNA can tell us where someone came from, it cannot tell us what shaped their soul. And that distinction is crucial. The public often searched for physical explanations, but perhaps the deeper answers were emotional. For example, consider this. Why do certain childhood memories remain powerful for decades? Why do some experiences continue influencing people long after they happen? The answer lies in emotional significance. The experiences that shape us most are rarely the ones we choose. They're the ones that leave a lasting mark. And Michael Jackson's childhood was filled with experiences unlike anything most people could imagine. Pressure, performance, expectations, responsibility, success at an age when most children are still discovering themselves. Those experiences didn't simply disappear. They became part of the foundation on which everything else was built. And if that's true, then perhaps the real DNA mystery has been misunderstood from the beginning, because the world focused on inherited traits. Meanwhile, something else was quietly shaping Michael's future: his environment, his experiences, his emotional world. Imagine two children born with similar talents. One grows up with complete freedom, the other grows up under extraordinary pressure. Years later, they may become completely different people, not because of DNA, because of experience. And that may be one of the hidden lessons in Michael Jackson's story. The person we become is influenced by far more than genetics. It's influenced by the moments that shape us, the challenges we face, the losses we experience, the dreams we carry, and the fears we never fully escape. Which brings us to another fascinating question. If Michael's childhood left such a powerful emotional imprint, could it also explain why the world struggled to understand him later in life? Because many of the qualities people found mysterious may have roots stretching all the way back to those early years. The desire for privacy, the attraction to imagination, the search for connection, the longing for understanding. Perhaps none of these things appeared suddenly. Perhaps they were part of a much larger story, a story that began long before fame reached its peak. And if that's true, then the DNA mystery becomes far more interesting, because we're no longer talking about biology. We're talking about identity. We're talking about the invisible experiences that shape a human life. We're talking about the emotional blueprint that no scientific test can measure. And in the next chapter, we're going to explore something even more revealing. Because once Michael Jackson became the most famous entertainer in the world, a new mystery emerged. A mystery involving fame itself. Because what if fame didn't answer Michael's questions? What if fame made them even bigger? And if that's what happened, then the real DNA mystery may have been hiding in plain sight all along. Not in his genes, but in the lifelong search to understand who he really was. By the time Michael Jackson entered adulthood, something unusual had already happened. He wasn't simply famous. He had become something much larger. A global phenomenon, a cultural symbol, a person recognized in almost every corner of the world. And that is where this mystery takes an unexpected turn, because most people assume fame provides answers. In reality, fame often creates more questions, especially when the person involved is someone as unique as Michael Jackson. Think about it. The more successful Michael became, the more the public wanted to understand him. At first, that curiosity focused on his music, his dancing, his performances, his creativity. But eventually, something changed. People became interested in Michael Jackson himself. Not the artist, the person. And once that happened, the questions multiplied. Why was he different? Why was he so private? Why did he seem so misunderstood? Why did he appear unlike any other celebrity? The public searched for explanations everywhere, and slowly those explanations became increasingly personal. People began studying photographs. Television programs analyzed his appearance. Newspapers debated every visible change. And before long, an idea emerged. Maybe the answer could be found in his genetics. Maybe the answer could be found in his DNA. But here's the strange part. The more people discussed Michael Jackson's DNA, the less they seemed to understand him, because the conversation was moving in the wrong direction. People were looking at physical traits. Meanwhile, the deeper mystery remained untouched: identity. You see, fame creates a powerful illusion. It convinces people that visibility equals understanding. But those two things are not the same. A person can be seen by millions and still remain deeply misunderstood. And Michael Jackson may be one of the clearest examples of that phenomenon. The world saw him constantly: concerts, interviews, award shows, television appearances, magazine covers. Yet despite all that exposure, people still felt they didn't know who he really was. That frustration fueled even more curiosity, and curiosity often searches for simple answers. People naturally prefer explanations they can see. Something concrete, something measurable, something physical. DNA sounds measurable. Identity does not, which is why the DNA mystery became so attractive. It felt scientific, objective, certain. But human beings are rarely that simple. The truth is that no laboratory can explain why one person inspires millions. No scientific test can explain imagination. No genetic report can explain creativity. And no DNA sequence can explain why Michael Jackson continues fascinating people decades after his death. Those answers exist somewhere else entirely, inside human experience, inside emotion, inside identity. And perhaps that's exactly what made Michael so difficult to understand, because he wasn't merely a celebrity, he became a symbol onto which millions of people projected their own ideas. Some saw genius, some saw mystery, some saw loneliness, some saw strength. Others saw vulnerability. Everyone seemed to see something different, and that may be one of the most revealing clues in this entire story. Because when a person becomes a symbol, people stop seeing who they are. They begin seeing what they represent, and Michael Jackson represented many different things to many different people: success, fame, talent, transformation, dreams, isolation, inspiration. The result was extraordinary. Millions of people felt connected to him, yet few agreed on who he actually was. Imagine living inside that reality. Imagine waking up each day knowing that the world has created countless versions of you. Versions that exist in newspapers, versions that exist on television, versions that exist in people's minds. Eventually, a strange question appears. Which version is real? That question may be more important than any discussion about DNA, because identity is not something inherited. It's something experienced. It's shaped by childhood, relationships, success, failure, pain, hope, memory, and all of those things influenced Michael Jackson's life far more than most people realize. The deeper we look, the clearer this becomes. The public focused on appearance, but appearance was only the surface. Beneath the surface existed a far more complicated story, a story involving pressure, expectation, fame, loneliness, and the challenge of remaining yourself while the entire world watches. Perhaps that's why the DNA mystery refuses to disappear, not because people are searching for scientific answers, because they're searching for emotional answers. They're trying to understand how someone could become so famous and yet remain so mysterious, how someone could be seen by everyone and still feel misunderstood, how someone could become larger than life while struggling to protect his own identity. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What if the DNA mystery was never about genetics? What if it was about humanity? Because in the final chapter, we're going to explore a possibility that changes everything. A possibility that connects childhood, fame, identity, and legacy into one powerful idea. And once you see that connection, the real Michael Jackson DNA mystery may finally begin to make sense. Because sometimes the answers we're looking for aren't hidden inside a person's DNA. Sometimes they're hidden inside their story. At the beginning of this documentary, we asked a question that most people never think to ask. What if the Michael Jackson DNA mystery has nothing to do with DNA at all? After exploring his childhood, his rise to fame, the public obsession with his appearance, and the struggle for identity that followed him throughout his life, we can finally see the larger picture. And surprisingly, the answer may be far simpler than the mystery itself, because when all the clues are placed together, a remarkable pattern emerges. Not a pattern about genetics, not a pattern about biology, a pattern about identity. For decades, people searched for physical explanations. They searched photographs. They studied family history. They analyzed every visible detail. The assumption was always the same. Somewhere there must be an answer. Somewhere there must be a simple explanation for Michael Jackson. But perhaps that assumption was the mistake, because human beings are not equations. They cannot be fully explained through measurements. The most important parts of a person are often invisible: dreams, fears, memories, emotions, experiences. None of these things can be found inside a laboratory, yet all of them shape who we become. And that may be the true lesson hidden inside this mystery. You see, DNA can tell us where someone came from. It cannot tell us where they are going. DNA can influence potential. It cannot explain purpose. DNA can shape physical characteristics. It cannot explain imagination, and it certainly cannot explain legacy, because if DNA alone created greatness, the world would be filled with Michael Jacksons. Instead, there was only one individual whose life became a global phenomenon, one individual whose influence crossed generations, languages, and cultures, one individual who continues fascinating people decades later. And that reality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most important parts of Michael Jackson's story were never genetic. They were human. Think about the questions people continue asking. Why did his music connect with so many people? Why does his story still generate discussion? Why do new generations continue discovering him? None of those questions can be answered by DNA. They're questions about emotion, connection, identity, meaning. And perhaps that is why the mystery remains alive, because people are still searching for the same thing: understanding, not scientific understanding, human understanding, the desire to understand how one person became one of the most influential entertainers in history, the desire to understand what drove him, what shaped him, what inspired him, and perhaps what troubled him. The deeper we explore those questions, the clearer the answer becomes. The world spent years looking at Michael Jackson's appearance. Meanwhile, the real mystery was happening somewhere else entirely, inside the experiences that shaped him, inside the pressures he faced, inside the dreams he carried, inside the struggle to remain himself while becoming one of the most recognized people on Earth. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. People became obsessed with Michael Jackson's DNA, but the most important clues were never hidden inside his genes. They were hidden inside his story, because stories reveal things science cannot. Stories reveal values, priorities, fears, motivations. They reveal the emotional blueprint behind a life. And when we examine Michael Jackson's story through that lens, a completely different picture appears. Not a mystery about appearance, not a mystery about identity. A mystery about what happens when extraordinary fame collides with ordinary human needs. The need for understanding, the need for connection, the need to remain authentic. Those needs exist in every human being. Michael Jackson simply experienced them under extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps that is why his story continues resonating around the world. Because beneath all the fame, people recognize something familiar. A person trying to navigate life. A person trying to protect who he was. A person trying to remain connected to something real. The details may be unique. The emotions are universal. Which brings us back to the original question: what is the Michael Jackson DNA mystery most people never notice? Perhaps it is this: the world became fascinated with the physical blueprint, while overlooking the emotional blueprint. The world searched for answers in genetics, while the deeper answers were hidden in experience. The world focused on appearance, while the real story was unfolding beneath the surface. And once you understand that distinction, the mystery begins to change. Because the question is no longer, what did Michael Jackson inherit? The question becomes, what did Michael Jackson become? And that answer cannot be found in DNA. It can only be found in the story of a life filled with achievement, pressure, creativity, curiosity, loneliness, connection, success, and the ongoing search for identity. Perhaps that is why people still talk about Michael Jackson today, not because every mystery has been solved, but because some mysteries continue teaching us something about ourselves. And maybe the greatest lesson hidden inside this story is simple. Human beings are more than biology, more than appearance, more than genetics. We are the sum of our experiences, our choices, our dreams, and our struggles. Michael Jackson's DNA may have helped create the man, but it did not create the legacy. The legacy was created through the life he lived, and that may be the one truth most people never notice. If you enjoyed this documentary, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the real Michael Jackson mystery was about genetics? Or was it always about identity? And if you'd like more deep psychological documentaries exploring the untold stories behind famous figures, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the most fascinating mysteries aren't hidden inside science, they're hidden inside the human experience.